September 1868. London, England. Outside the Central Criminal Court of the United Kingdom, popularly known as the Old Bailey, a thick autumn fog rolls off the River Thames, mixing with the smoke of coal fires. Inside, the atmosphere is suffocating. The public gallery is packed to its absolute capacity. Members of the British aristocracy, wealthy merchants, street vendors, and investigative journalists sit shoulder to shoulder. They have queued for hours in the cold London rain just to secure a seat. On the witness stand stands a figure who looks entirely out of place in this grand, intimidating courtroom. Her name is Mary Tucker Borrodale. She is a widow of a distinguished military officer, an elite member of the upper middle class, and a woman who once possessed an independent fortune. But today, she is a ghost of her former self. She is visibly shaking. Her voice is a fragile whisper that barely carries to the jury box. She has been financially ruined, socially isolated, and subjected to weeks of brutal public mockery. Across the courtroom, sitting in the prisoner's dock, is the architect of this destruction, Sarah Rachel Leverson, known to the world by her glamorous pseudonym, Madame Rachel. To the casual observer, Madame Rachel does not look like a hardened criminal. She is a middle-aged woman dressed in expensive silks, her face heavily adorned with the very cosmetics that brought her fame. For nearly a decade, she operated an ultra-luxurious salon on New Bond Street, located in London's exclusive West End shopping district. Her marketing slogan was a promise that captivated the most affluent, desperate women of the Victorian era, beautiful forever. But on this September morning, the grand illusion is systematically dismantled by the prosecution. The Crown attorneys reveal that Madame Rachel's signature treatment, an incredibly expensive royal bath utilizing sacred, exotic waters allegedly imported from the River Jordan, was nothing more than ordinary London tap water. It was drawn from the local supply, heated in a back room, and mixed with cheap bran, common yellow soap, and hazardous chemical compounds. Worse still, the court is presented with a staggering revelation. Madame Rachel did not merely overcharge her clients for fraudulent anti-aging creams. She systematically trapped them. The prosecution introduces a sprawling, terrifying web of criminality, a deliberate plot involving forged love letters from a prominent British nobleman, elaborate psychological manipulation, and cold-blooded extortion. Using these methods, Madame Rachel stripped Mrs. Borrodale of her entire life savings, over £5,000 sterling. In the 1860s, this was a massive fortune, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of pounds today. In an era where a woman's social reputation was her most valuable currency, Madame Rachel transformed the pursuit of youth into a weapon of total financial and psychological execution. This case leaves us with profound, unsettling questions. How did a penniless woman from the impoverished slums of London build an empire that completely deceived the highest echelons of British society? How did she convince an educated, wealthy widow that a literal lord was madly in love with her, all while systematically draining her bank accounts? And what dark, unspeakable secrets did she threaten to expose that kept her victims entirely silent for so long? If you are interested in global true crime told with deep historical context, criminal psychology, and thorough investigative detail, consider subscribing to Enter the Crime and hitting the notification bell so you never miss an archive breakdown. To understand the sheer scale of this deception, and to comprehend how a luxury salon became a criminal operation of unprecedented scale, we must look beyond the courtroom. We must look at the hidden anxieties of the society that created both the predator and the victim. Because to understand how it got here, we have to go back. To understand the rise and fall of Madame Rachel, we must first orient ourselves in the world she inhabited, London in the 1860s. This is the absolute peak of the Victorian era. Great Britain is the undisputed economic and industrial powerhouse of the world. Wealth is flowing into the capital from every corner of the global empire. The streets of the West End are filled with opulent carriages, grand brownstone townhouses, and elite shopping arcades where the wealthy display their status. Yet, beneath this glittering surface of extreme wealth, strict etiquette, and high moral posturing lies a society deeply fractured by rigid class structures, extreme gender inequality, and profound psychological taboos. For a person unfamiliar with the history of the United Kingdom, it is important to understand that Victorian society was obsessed with the concept of public respectability. This was not merely a social preference, it was an absolute requirement for survival within the upper and middle classes. For women of this era, the social pressures were immense and fundamentally contradictory. The patriarchal structure of the time demanded that women of high standing be pristine, elegant, and entirely free from the visible signs of aging or stress. A youthful, unblemished face was viewed as a direct reflection of a woman's moral purity, her health, and her social value. However, the Victorian moral code placed a strict, unyielding prohibition on the use of visible artificial cosmetics. During this period, any woman who wore obvious makeup, referred to disparagingly as paint, was immediately cast out of polite society. Visible cosmetics were strictly associated with actresses and street-level sex workers, individuals who were viewed by the Victorian establishment with intense moral suspicion and disgust. A respectable woman was expected to possess an absolutely flawless complexion, but she was legally and socially forbidden from admitting that she used any artificial assistance to achieve it. This created a massive, highly toxic psychological climate. Thousands of wealthy women were terrified of aging, terrified of losing their social status, and simultaneously terrified of being caught using beauty products. They were trapped in a state of perpetual secrecy. They desperately sought anti-aging lotions, hair dyes, and skin treatments, but they had to procure them in absolute shadow. This culture of intense shame, isolation, and enforced privacy created the perfect breeding ground for a master manipulator. It created a marketplace where the currency was not just money, but secrets. It was within this hypocritical landscape that Sarah Rachel Leverson found her calling. Born Sarah Rachel Russell around 1814, her early life was a masterclass in survival amidst the brutal realities of urban poverty. Raised in the impoverished areas of London, she was a woman of immense natural intelligence, profound ambition, and a sharp, instinctive understanding of human psychology. She possessed no formal education, no wealthy family connections, and no structural advantages. Her early adulthood was defined by instability. She married multiple times, changing her name to Leverson, and worked a variety of low-paying, working-class jobs. She sold second-hand clothes, operated as a small-scale money lender, and even sold fried fish on the streets of London. Through these experiences, she observed the rawest elements of human nature. She saw how desperate people became when they were broke, how greedy they became when they saw an opportunity, and, most importantly, how easily people could be manipulated if you spoke directly to their deepest insecurities. In the late 1850s, Sarah Rachel Leverson decided she would no longer live on the margins of society. She realized that while the poor had little to offer her, the wealthy had an endless supply of money and an equally endless supply of anxiety. She underwent a complete, dazzling reinvention. She discarded her working-class identity, adopted an air of exotic sophistication, and emerged as Madame Rachel. She acquired a prime retail location on New Bond Street, one of the most prestigious, expensive commercial avenues in London's West End. The storefront was styled to look like an elite, continental apothecary and beauty salon. The windows were filled with elegant glass jars, expensive perfumes, and beautifully printed pamphlets. Madame Rachel dressed herself in lavish, heavy fabrics, adorned her fingers with expensive rings, and spoke with an authoritative, mysterious cadence. She began publishing highly descriptive marketing pamphlets that were distributed throughout the wealthy neighborhoods of Mayfair and Belgravia. In these texts, she claimed that she was a highly trained expert who had traveled across the distant lands of the East to procure secret, ancient formulas. She claimed her products utilized rare ingredients used by Egyptian royalty and Syrian nobles, ingredients that could erase wrinkles, restore youth, and render a woman, as her trademarked phrase declared, beautiful forever. To the general public walking past her new Bond Street shop, Madame Rachel appeared to be a successful, high-end businesswoman catering to luxury tastes. But to the wealthy clients who walked through her doors, she presented herself as something far more valuable, a trusted confidant. She understood that her clients were committing a social sin by visiting her. Therefore, she designed her salon around the concept of total discretion. She utilized private back entrances so clients could enter without being seen from the main street. Consultations were conducted in heavily curtained, private rooms filled with exotic incense and soft lighting. Madame Rachel would look into the eyes of these wealthy, anxious women and promise them absolute secrecy. She assured them that their husbands, their families, and their social circles would never know the truth about how they maintained their youth. But from the very beginning, a close examination of her business model reveals that something here was deeply off. Madame Rachel was not a chemist. She had no knowledge of dermatology or medicine. She was buying bulk industrial ingredients and cheap soaps, mixing them in her back kitchen, and selling them at a markup of thousands of %. More importantly, she was not just keeping her clients' secrets to protect them. She was documenting them. Every private consultation, every confession of marital distress, every debt an upper-class woman incurred to buy a cosmetic cream was a piece of intelligence that Madame Rachel filed away in her mind. She was building an information network, waiting for the perfect victim to walk through her door. In the early 1860s, that perfect victim arrived. Her name was Mary Tucker Borrowdale. To understand the tragedy that was about to unfold, we must understand Mrs. Borrowdale not as the caricature the media later made her out to be, but as a human being with profound vulnerabilities. Mary Borrowdale was the widow of a colonel in the British East India Company's military forces. Following her husband's death, she was left with a very comfortable life. She possessed an independent income, a substantial amount of capital invested in stocks, and a prestigious social standing. By all accounts of Victorian law, she was a woman of property and independence. However, her personal life was defined by a profound, aching loneliness. She was an aging widow in a society that increasingly ignored women as they grew older. She felt her social relevance slipping away. She looked in the mirror and saw the natural signs of aging, and she felt an intense, desperate pressure to reclaim her youth so she could remain visible in her elite social circles. She was independent in terms of finances, but psychologically, she was deeply isolated, lacking a trusted family network or analytical advisors to protect her. When Mary Borrowdale first stepped over the threshold of Madame Rachel's new Bond Street salon, she was looking for a simple cosmetic solution to improve her complexion. What she found was a psychological predator who immediately recognized that this woman was worth thousands of pounds. Madame Rachel did not just see a customer, she saw an asset to be systematically liquidated. The early interactions between the two women contained subtle warning signs that went completely unheeded. Madame Rachel began by offering standard, expensive lotions, but she quickly escalated her assessments. She told Mrs. Borrowdale that her skin condition was severe, that ordinary treatments would fail, and that she required the most advanced, secretive, and expensive procedures available in the salon. Mrs. Borrowdale, desperate for validation and reassurance, believed every word. She trusted this sophisticated woman who seemed so deeply concerned with her welfare. This sets the stage for a dramatic shift in their relationship. A date was fast approaching after which everything would change. A moment where a simple commercial transaction would transform into a terrifying labyrinth of high society fraud. The criminal operation executed by Madame Rachel against Mary Borrowdale was a masterclass in progressive psychological grooming. It did not begin with an overt demand for money. It began by establishing complete control over the victim's reality. The first step in the mechanical sequence of actions was the introduction of the specialized magnetic baths and skin enameling procedures. Madame Rachel convinced Mrs. Borrowdale that to achieve the promised state of being beautiful forever, she needed to undergo a prolonged course of treatment. These treatments were priced at astronomical rates. A single bath could cost anywhere from £20 to £100, amounts that represented the entire annual wage of a working-class Victorian servant. During these sessions, Mrs. Borrowdale was stripped of her clothing, placed in private baths, and subjected to a process called enameling. This involved applying a thick, paste-like cosmetic compound containing white lead, arsenic, and other chemicals directly onto the skin of the face and neck to fill in wrinkles and create a smooth, porcelain-like mask. This process was physically restrictive and mentally numbing. It kept the victim in a state of physical dependency within the walls of the salon. Once Madame Rachel realized that Mrs. Borrowdale would pay any price without question, she initiated the second, far more dangerous phase of the fraud. She realized that financial greed could be amplified by emotional manipulation. In 1866, during one of Mrs. Borrowdale's visits to the salon, Madame Rachel staged a seemingly accidental encounter. A distinguished-looking gentleman walked through the shop. After he left, Madame Rachel turned to Mrs. Borrowdale with an expression of manufactured shock and excitement. She informed the widow that the man was none other than Thomas Heron Jones, the 7th Viscount Ranelagh. Lord Ranelagh was a real, highly prominent member of the British aristocracy, known in London society as a wealthy, lifelong bachelor. Madame Rachel looked at Mrs. Borrowdale and delivered a stunning piece of news. Lord Ranelagh had looked upon her during her treatments, had been completely captivated by her newly restored, enameled beauty, and had fallen deeply, passionately in love with her. Rachel claimed that the Lord desperately wished to seek her hand in marriage. For a lonely, aging widow who felt discarded by society, this fantasy was incredibly powerful. The prospect of marrying a peer of the realm, becoming a viscountess, and securing her place at the absolute pinnacle of British high society was overwhelming. Madame Rachel had successfully identified and exploited Mrs. Borrowdale's ultimate vulnerability. But immediately, constraints were introduced to maintain control over the narrative. Madame Rachel explained that because of the rigid political structures of the aristocracy, the fierce opposition of the Lord's family, and the immense social scandal that would arise from an unchaperoned courtship, Lord Ranelagh could absolutely not communicate with Mrs. Borrowdale directly. He could not visit her home, he could not be seen with her in public, and he could not speak to her openly. Everything had to remain an absolute secret. Madame Rachel positioned herself as the vital, solitary conduit between the two lovers. She would manage all communication, all logistics, and all arrangements. Shortly after this conversation, the letters began to arrive. They were delivered to Mrs. Borrowdale through Madame Rachel. The letters were written on elegant stationery, filled with passionate, romantic declarations, and signed simply with the name William, which was indeed Lord Ranelagh's first name. In reality, these letters were complete fabrications. They were written either by Madame Rachel herself or by her associates who were skilled in forgery and deceptive writing. The content of these letters was designed with brilliant psychological precision. They would flatter Mrs. Borrowdale, telling her how much her beauty meant to the Lord, but they would always pivot to a specific, urgent financial problem. The fake Lord would claim that he was temporarily facing legal difficulties with his grand estates, or that his funds were tied up in complex aristocratic trusts. He would write that as his future wife, it was imperative that she assist him through this brief financial crisis. He promised that once they were married, all her money would be returned tenfold, and she would live in unparalleled luxury as a noblewoman. Madame Rachel reinforced these written lies with intense verbal pressure. Whenever Mrs. Borrowdale showed a moment of hesitation or doubt, Rachel would step in to manage her constraints. She would tell the widow that the Lord was incredibly sensitive, and that if she showed any lack of trust by withholding funds, he would break off the engagement immediately. Rachel also reminded her of the immense social ruin that would follow if anyone found out she had been participating in a secret courtship with a nobleman without a proper chaperone. Driven by a combination of intense hope, romantic delusion, and profound fear of losing this miraculous opportunity, Mary Borrowdale began to systematically liquidate her entire life. She started by handing over all the cash she possessed. When her bank accounts were emptied, Madame Rachel introduced her to complicit attorneys and shady money lenders. Under Rachel's direct supervision, Mrs. Borrowdale signed documents to sell off her valuable shares in the funds. She sold her personal property. She transferred ownership of her expensive jewelry directly to Madame Rachel, under the pretense that the jewelry was being sent to the Lord's estate to be reset in royal diamonds for their wedding. Finally, in an act of complete desperation, she signed away her late husband's military widow's pension, her ultimate safety net for her old age. Month after month, the money flowed directly into Madame Rachel's hands. Yet, the wedding date was constantly postponed. The fake lord always had a new excuse, a new legal complication, a new emergency that required just a few £100s more. If you were analyzing this situation as it happened, at what point do you think the psychological barrier breaks? If you had already given up half your life savings, would you keep paying just because admitting you were conned would mean total social death? By late 1867, Mary Borrowdale was completely broke. She had given Madame Rachel over £5,000 sterling, leaving herself literally destitute. She had no money left to pay her rent, buy food, or maintain her basic lifestyle. When she arrived at the salon, no longer capable of providing financial assets, the illusion shattered instantly. The warm, supportive Madame Rachel disappeared. Her tone turned icy and predatory. She informed Mrs. Borrowdale that she owed the salon massive debts for her beauty treatments and storage fees for her bridal clothing. When Mrs. Borrowdale wept and begged to see Lord Ranelagh, Madame Rachel dropped all pretense. She openly threatened her victim. Rachel stated that if Mrs. Borrowdale caused any trouble, went to the police, or failed to clear her alleged debts, Rachel would release all of Mrs. Borrowdale's private, highly compromising love letters to the public press and her family, ensuring she would be branded a loose, disgraced woman and cast out of society forever. Madame Rachel believed her victim's fear of social disgrace would guarantee her perpetual silence. She assumed that an upper-class Victorian woman would rather starve in poverty than face the public shame of a courtroom scandal. But Rachel had underestimated the desperation of a human being who had been pushed completely to the brink. Left with absolutely nothing to lose, Mary Borrowdale walked away from the salon and sought legal counsel. And that's when the real nightmare began. When Mary Borrowdale finally overcame her terror and brought her extraordinary story to the authorities, the initial police response was highly skeptical. To the detectives operating in London's law enforcement framework, the initial theory was that this was a civil dispute regarding an unpaid bill at a luxury shop, or perhaps a case of a wealthy customer experiencing severe buyer's remorse after spending too much on vanity products. However, as formal legal depositions were taken, attorneys and investigators realized that the allegations pointed to a massive, coordinated, multi-year criminal conspiracy. A formal investigation was launched, but it immediately ran into immense legal and cultural walls unique to the Victorian era. The first major hurdle was the total lack of cooperation from potential witnesses. Investigators knew that Mary Borrowdale was highly unlikely to be Madame Rachel's only victim. The ledger books seized from the New Bond Street salon hinted at dozens of wealthy, prominent women who had paid exorbitant sums under highly unusual circumstances. But when detectives attempted to interview these women, they encountered an unyielding wall of silence. High society families were horrified at the prospect of their names being connected to Madame Rachel. Husbands threatened to disown their wives if they spoke to detectives, and independent women fled the city or refused to answer the door. The societal shame surrounding the use of cosmetics and the fear of extortion was so powerful that it actively paralyzed the police investigation. Detectives were forced to build their case almost entirely around the testimony of a single, deeply traumatized witness, Mary Borrowdale. This allowed Madame Rachel's defense team to mount an incredibly aggressive counter-strategy. They recognized that the entire case rested on credibility. In the 1860s, a woman's testimony in a court of law was heavily scrutinized through the lens of her behavior and her compliance with gender norms. The defense launched a massive character assassination campaign against Mrs. Borrowdale long before the trial even began. They leaked stories to the press painting the widow as a erratic, vain, and hypersexualized older woman who had developed an unhealthy, delusional obsession with Lord Ranelagh. They argued that Madame Rachel was merely an innocent shopkeeper who had provided requested services, and that Mrs. Borrowdale had invented the entire story of the romance to explain away her own reckless financial spending to her family. The investigation quickly turned into a high-stakes thriller, defined by multiple dramatic narrative reversals that kept the public and the police in a state of constant suspense. The first major reversal occurred when detectives focused their attention on the mysterious Lord Ranelagh letters. Detectives thought they had their man. They believed that perhaps the real Lord Ranelagh was a secret co-conspirator who had active knowledge of the plot and was splitting the profits with Madame Rachel. They issued a formal summons for the aristocrat, bringing him into an interrogation room. The entire country held its breath. If a peer of the realm was implicated in a sordid West End extortion racket, it would be the biggest political scandal of the decade. But when Lord Ranelagh took the stand during the preliminary hearings, the investigation shifted dramatically. The Lord looked at Mary Borrowdale and swore under oath that he had never spoken to her, had never authorized anyone to use his name, and had never written a single word to her. He proved that on many of the dates listed in the forged love letters, he was not even present in the City of London. The real Lord Ranelagh was completely cleared of any criminal involvement. This revealed the true depth of the plot. Madame Rachel had used a phantom aristocrat to execute her crime. The evidence now seemed completely conclusive against Madame Rachel, until the defense presented their second major reversal. They argued that even if the letters were proven to be total forgeries, there was absolutely no physical, forensic evidence connecting the handwriting on those letters directly to Madame Rachel. Because forensic science in 1868 was in its absolute infancy, document analysis was highly primitive. There were no fingerprinting techniques, no advanced chemical analysis of inks, and no established standards for handwriting comparison that could stand up as ironclad proof in a criminal court. The defense argued that an unknown third party, perhaps a rogue clerk or an anonymous enemy of Madame Rachel, had intercepted Mrs. Borrowdale and sent her the letters without Rachel's knowledge. For a time, it looked as though the prosecution's case would collapse due to a lack of a direct link between the forgery and the defendant. The entire investigation was deadlocked, facing massive institutional and public pressure. The British government was desperate for a conviction to restore public confidence in the safety of West End commerce and to protect the integrity of the upper classes. The press was demanding answers. Then, a third dramatic narrative reversal occurred. Investigators executed a comprehensive, deep-dive search of financial institutions and secondary properties connected to Madame Rachel's family network. They were looking for a paper trail, And they found it. They discovered a series of highly specific documents, power of attorney forms, stock transfer receipts, and banking ledgers. When carefully analyzed, these documents revealed that the exact days and hours Mary Borradaile had liquidated her various financial assets. The proceeds were not sent to an anonymous third party, nor were they held in trust. They were deposited directly into the private, personal bank accounts of Sarah Rachel Leverson and her daughters. Furthermore, police located a receipt signed by Madame Rachel herself for the sale of Mrs. Borradaile's valuable jewelry to a local pawnbroker. The confession of innocent ignorance sounded ironclad, until these financial documents surfaced. The prosecution now had an undeniable, physical link between the execution of the fraud and the direct financial enrichment of the suspect. Yet, despite this powerful evidence, the battle was far from won. The first trial, held in the summer of 1868, exposed the intense class and gender biases of the time. After hours of deliberation, the jury was completely deadlocked, resulting in a hung jury. Several male jurors openly stated that they believed Mrs. Borradaile was simply too foolish to protect, and that her own vanity made her entirely responsible for her financial loss, refusing to convict Madame Rachel. The British state, horrified by this failure, immediately ordered a second trial to take place in September of that same year. The legal teams retreated to refine their strategies. And now, the entire case would be decided in a single room. To understand why this case captivated an entire empire, we must look past the sensationalized headlines of the era and conduct a rigorous, documented psychological breakdown of both the predator and the victim. Madame Rachel was not a primitive thief. She was a highly sophisticated psychological operator who practiced a historical form of coercive control and affinity fraud. Her criminal mindset was based entirely on an expert diagnostic assessment of the structural flaws within Victorian culture. She recognized that the intense demand for female respectability, combined with the enforced legal dependency of women, created a class of people who were profoundly isolated. In Victorian England, an unmarried or widowed woman with property had financial assets, but she lacked social and legal protection if her reputation was compromised. Madame Rachel understood that fear is a far more powerful motivator than greed. When we analyze her behavior through her documented statements and courtroom testimony, we see that she utilized a highly calculated methodology of isolation. The moment a wealthy woman entered her salon and confessed a secret, whether it was a fear of wrinkles, a hidden debt, or an unhappy marriage, Madame Rachel shifted the dynamic from a business transaction to an alliance. She would tell her clients, "Only I can help you. Only I can keep your secrets safe from your husband and the world." By doing this, she systematically severed the victim's psychological connection to their normal support networks. She ensured that the victim felt entirely dependent on her goodwill. Once isolation was achieved, she initiated the process of reality distortion, commonly known today as gaslighting. In the case of Mary Borradaile, Rachel constructed a completely false social reality. She took a lonely woman's deep desire for affection, validation, and status, and fed it a meticulously crafted lie. When Mrs. Borradaile began to receive the forged letters from the fake Lord Ranelagh, her critical thinking skills were compromised by the emotional high of the romance and the physical and mental exhaustion of her intensive beauty treatments. Every time Mrs. Borradaile expressed doubt, Madame Rachel would manipulate her constraints, turning the doubt into a moral failing on the victim's part. She would say, "The Lord will think you do not love him if you ask for proof. A true lady trusts her future husband." This brings us to a crucial, transformative reframing insight that completely changes how we view this historical case. For over a century, the dominant historical narrative, driven by contemporary 19th-century newspaper accounts, portrayed Mary Borradaile as a cartoonish figure of ultimate ridicule. She was mocked as a vain, foolish older woman who was so blinded by her own arrogance that she deserved to lose her fortune. But modern victimology and psychological analysis reveal a far more tragic and complex reality. Mary Borrowdale was experiencing the profound, debilitating effects of long-term psychological grooming and trauma bonding. When an individual is isolated, constantly told that their survival and status depend on maintaining a specific secret relationship, and subjected to alternating cycles of validation and intense threat, their cognitive independence is eroded. Mrs. Borrowdale did not continue giving money because she was stupid. She continued giving money because she was trapped in a psychological escalation trap. Having already sacrificed her cash, admitting the truth meant accepting total financial ruin and absolute social death. She kept paying because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. The broader community reaction to the trial exposed the deep-seated fears of the Victorian public. Society was utterly terrified by Madame Rachel because she represented the ultimate disruption of the natural order. She was a lower-class woman who had managed to acquire immense wealth and power by exploiting the secrets of the upper classes. She proved that the appearance of high society elegance was not an inherent, noble trait, but a product that could be bought, manufactured, and faked in a Bond Street shop. The media narrative surrounding the trial reflected this terror, transforming the legal proceedings into a grotesque circus. Satirical magazines like Punch, The Tomahawk, and The Saturday Review ran merciless columns and aggressive caricatures. However, a deeper analysis reveals a highly disturbing element of this media coverage. Because Madame Rachel was of Jewish descent, the press heavily weaponized the anti-Semitic tropes of the era. They portrayed her not merely as a fraudster, but as a predatory, supernatural witch, a Gothic ogress who was literally draining the life and purity out of innocent Christian women. By focusing the public's attention on Rachel's ethnicity and Mrs. Borrowdale's alleged vanity, the media successfully avoided having to report on the real, systemic issue, a hypocritical social system that denied women legal agency and penalized them so harshly for aging that they became easy prey for extortion. The stage was set for a final, historic confrontation. The psychological lines were drawn, the public was whipped into a frenzy of judgment, and all of this came to a head when the verdict was read. The second trial of Madame Rachel in September 1868 drew to its conclusion under an atmosphere of electric tension. The prosecution had successfully reinforced their financial evidence, presenting an unassailable mountain of bank transfers and receipts that proved Rachel had directly pocketed Mary Borrowdale's fortune. The defense's attempts to frame the entire affair as a harmless cosmetic bill or a delusion of the victim fell apart under the sheer weight of the documented paper trail. The jury retired to deliberate, fully aware that the eyes of the entire British Empire were upon them. This time, there would be no deadlock. After a relatively brief deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The verdict was read: guilty of obtaining money under false pretenses. The courtroom erupted into a wave of murmurs and whispers. Madame Rachel stood in the dock, her composure finally fracturing as the reality of her situation set in. The judge looked down at the prisoner and delivered a scathing address, denouncing her crimes as a systematic, heartless exploitation of human weakness. He sentenced Sarah Rachel Leverson to 5 years of penal servitude. For a woman accustomed to luxury, expensive silks, and the comforts of the West End, this was a devastating sentence. Penal servitude in the Victorian era meant transfer to a harsh, cold convict prison, where prisoners were subjected to absolute silence, solitary confinement, an unyielding diet of gruel, and hours of exhausting, repetitive hard labor, such as picking oakum or turning the crank. The high society salon on New Bond Street was permanently closed by the authorities. Its grand furnishings, exotic perfume bottles, and remaining stock of cosmetic pots were put up for public auction, drawing crowds of curious onlookers who wanted to possess a piece of the infamous Beautiful Forever empire. But for the primary victim, Mary Tucker Borrowdale, the legal victory brought absolutely no restoration. The trial had achieved justice in the eyes of the state, but it left her life completely hollowed out. Her entire independent fortune was gone, permanently absorbed into Rachel's hidden family networks or spent on legal fees. She was left completely bankrupt, dependent on the charity of distant relatives to survive. Worse still, her social standing was utterly obliterated. Polite society did not welcome her back as a vindicated victim. Instead, she was permanently blacklisted, avoided by her former friends, and remembered by a judgmental public as a laughingstock, the woman who had destroyed her life for a phantom courtship. Mary Borrowdale lived out the remainder of her days in poverty and absolute obscurity, a tragic testament to the human cost of systematic psychological fraud. Astonishingly, the historical timeline reveals an even more bizarre turn of events. Sarah Rachel Leverson served her 5 years of penal servitude, surviving the brutal prison regime. Upon her release in the mid-1870s, she showed absolutely no signs of rehabilitation. She possessed the exact same predatory mindset and ambition that had driven her before. She returned straight to the wealthy districts of London, adopted a new alias, and opened a brand-new beauty salon. She began printing new pamphlets, utilizing the exact same cosmetic fraud, fake noble courtships, and extortion techniques that she had mastered a decade earlier. Her criminal escalation continued until 1878, when she targeted another wealthy woman. This time, however, the public and the police were highly aware of her methods. She was swiftly caught, arrested, and put on trial a third time. She was convicted once again and sentenced to a longer term of imprisonment. Her criminal career finally came to an absolute end on March 12, 1880, when she died behind bars inside the bleak walls of London's Holloway prison. The legacy of the Madame Rachel trials extended far beyond the sensational headlines of the 1860s. The case served as a profound turning point in the legal and cultural history of the United Kingdom. In the legal sphere, the trial exposed massive, dangerous vulnerabilities in how English law handled consumer deception, fraud, and psychological extortion. It forced jurists and lawmakers to re-examine the definition of consent and coercion, paving the way for more robust consumer protection regulations and stricter penalties for financial manipulation. In the cultural and medical sphere, the trial stripped away the dangerous mystery of the completely unregulated Victorian beauty industry. The courtroom disclosures forced the public to confront the terrifying reality of what they were putting on their skin. Medical experts took to public platforms to warn that unauthorized cosmetics were frequently laced with deadly poisons like lead, mercury, and arsenic, leading to a gradual push for the regulation of chemical ingredients in consumer goods. Furthermore, the case added significant momentum to the historical fight for women's legal rights. The total financial destruction of Mary Borrowdale highlighted the extreme danger of a legal system that left women highly vulnerable to property theft and psychological isolation. The public exposure of this vulnerability contributed directly to the intense social pressures that eventually culminated in the passage of the Married Women's Property Acts, which fundamentally transformed the legal rights of women to own, manage, and protect their independent assets within the United Kingdom. Madame Rachel's empire was built entirely on a foundation of manufactured insecurity, societal hypocrisy, and the weaponization of human shame. She proved to the world that the most dangerous aspect of a criminal scam is not the complexity of the lie itself, but the target's terrifying fear of the truth being told. Today, the grand, historic buildings of New Bond Street still stand, completely transformed by the rush of modern luxury commerce and high-end fashion. Millions of shoppers walk those streets every year, entirely unaware of the dark history beneath their feet. The luxury salons are gone, but the fundamental vulnerabilities of human nature remain completely unchanged. The house still stands. The questions do too. If you want to explore more deep historical true crime investigations that reveal the hidden psychology and untold stories of the justice system, please click on our recommended archive playlist displayed on your screen right now. What aspect of Madame Rachel's method of psychological manipulation and social extortion do you find the most surprising? Do you believe the Victorian justice system handled this case fairly, or was the victim unfairly penalized by society? Let us know your analysis in the comments section below. Thank you for watching EnterTheCrime. If you appreciated this documentary, please leave a like, share this investigation, and subscribe to join our global true crime research community. Stay analytical, stay respectful, and we will see you in the next case file.